Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today we have a hand from a $1,000 buy-in World Series of Poker event. Early in the day, we get Ace King on the button. What more do we want in life? And playing 25-50, we're just going to make a regular 3 big blind raise. If you're playing 100-100 with a 100 big blind ante, maybe you want to make it more like 400. I think that'd be perfectly fine, given we are somewhat deep. That said, in this scenario, I think 3 big blinds is perfectly fine. Small blind, maybe a tight guy, I don't know. Calls, flop comes 9-8-2. This is the spot where every poker player hates to be because they have Ace King, a really good pre-flop hand, but it just got significantly worse. So, what do? Do you just blindly continuation bet 100% of the time? No, because think about the opponent's range, right? In this scenario, the opponent to call in the small blind, assuming they are, normal/reasonably tight, is probably going to be mostly hands like big cards, which will fold to a bet, but if they decide to raise, it's really bad for me, because I need to fold. And pairs, like 10-9, Ace-9 suited, and Ace-8 suited, and 8-7 suited, right? So if our opponent does have overcards, he's drawing nearly dead, or at least relatively thin. And if our opponent has a pair, we're in pretty bad shape. So this is a very classic way ahead or way behind scenario. And in way ahead or way behind scenarios, you typically want to do a lot of checking or betting small. Now, whenever you are betting small, very often that is an indicator that you are just betting with your entire range. And I don't think this is a board I want to bet with my entire range, because if you think about it, when I raise button, I could have 50-60% of hands, maybe even wider, depending on what I think of my opponents. And the player in the small blind should only have, way less than 60% of hands, right? So the opponent's range should be much tighter than my range here, which means they should very often have a little bit of an advantage. Of course, my opponent may 3-bet their best hands, which hurts their range overall. But even then, this board should connect somewhat well with them, and, it connects only marginally with me. So in this scenario, I think we need to just check behind. Using Ace King is a very clear marginal made hand. I discussed thoroughly over at my site, pokercoaching.com, there it is, that when you have a marginal made hand on a board that should be okay for your opponent, or great for your opponent, you want to do a lot of checking. You want to be checking your marginal made hands that can somewhat confidently get to showdown, and you also want to be checking some junk that's just completely giving up. And you want to be betting your best made hands and your draws. And right here, Ace King is on the border between a marginal made hand and junk. It's certainly not a hand I can bet for 3 streets for value, right? So it's obviously not a good hand anymore. We started with a good pre-flop hand, it got a lot worse, and that is okay. That's often going to happen. So just check. Now on the turn, it's a jack. Think about that range I gave my opponent earlier. If they have a pair, they're not going to fold to a bet. And if they have overcards, a lot of those just improve to a jack, right? Now, of course, my opponent may bet with a lot of their jacks on the turn, but this is a scenario where if my opponent does have overcards, or, big cards higher than the 9, it's going to be either Ace-10, which I beat, Ace-Queen, which I beat, King-Queen, which I beat, or King-10, which I beat, right? And of course, my opponent will continue with those hands, but my opponent may actually raise with a lot of those because all of those have at least a gut shot, right? And from out of position, people like to raise with their junky draws, as they very often should, especially if the board is somewhat coordinated. So this is a scenario where, again, once my opponent checks the turn, I do not need to bet because pairs are not folding and draws have a decent amount of equity and they may raise me, which would also be quite bad. So now I have a marginal made hand. It got a little bit worse. That's okay. Just keep checking. River's a 3, which is a complete blank. And now the opponent bets 225. This is a pretty rough spot. So now, like I said, I pretty much have a bad marginal made hand or a very good junk hand. And this is where it's very important to consider your range and what it actually looks like and what it is. And from doing a lot of study away from the table, I know that in this scenario, especially when the opponent uses a somewhat big bet size, 2/3 pot, Ace King is usually going to end up being a call. If we're folding out Ace King, we're probably going to end up folding out a little bit too much. And For that reason, we need to call. Yes, we're going to lose a lot of the time, but that's okay. We're probably going to win here, I don't know, 40% of the time, give or take. Notice if our opponent potted it, we only need to win 33% of the time, so here we only need to win like 28% of the time or so. So I just told you we're probably going about 40% of the time, right? 40 is greater than 28, so we have a call. And the way we figure out how often we're going to win is by assessing our opponent's range. And in this scenario, our opponent is going to feel very inclined to bet with King, Queen, King 10, Ace 10, and then also may feel inclined to bet with some stuff that just happened to have nothing at this point, like 7-6 or 5-4 if our opponent does have those hands and decided to call preflop. Also, a lot of people in this scenario will not value bet with an 8 on the river and may not even value bet with a 9 on the river. So if they're not going to value bet with an 8 or a 9, this becomes an even easier call because now their value range just shrank, which essentially makes their bluffing range become a larger total portion of their range. Like, for example, say they normally have 100 value hands they could bet and 30 bluffs, but they're just not betting with 50 of those bluffs. Now it shrinks to 50 value hands and 30 bluffs, which becomes way better for me. So this is a scenario where I think we just need to call most of the time without some sort of a read. If you have a read on your opponent, they just really like their hand, obviously you should be folding. But readless, especially early in a tournament where losing doesn't really cost you many chips, I'm a big fan of calling. One other benefit of calling early in these tournaments is that you learn a lot. If your opponent just shows up with Jack 9, you know, okay, guy may not be bluffing so much. Or, you know, you check the turn. That's good information, right? You learn a lot when you call, and you learn essentially nothing when you fold. And when you can learn relatively cheaply, it is highly valuable. Now, that doesn't mean you should call here with 5-4 for the nut low to see what your opponent's doing. Don't do that. Don't just give your money away. You want to be calling in spots where the calls are marginal, and this is a marginal call, but the information you gain has at least some value some portion of the time. Because if your opponent shows up with a bluff here, that's pretty good information to get right in the beginning of the tournament. Also, you know, if you call here and your opponent is bluffing, maybe they don't bluff you so much throughout the rest of the tournament, which is quite nice. I mean, at the beginning of a cash game session or early in a tournament, I'm a big fan of 3-betting, 4-betting, 5-betting, whatever you can do to make your opponents realize you came to fight, which will make them way less inclined to fight, which will allow you to steal a lot of the small pots instead of letting them steal a lot of the small pots. So anyway, I think this is a pretty easy call early in a tournament. We're going to lose a lot of the time, but that's fine. And this time the opponent does have the King 10. I think King 10 is probably just a hand the opponent should bet on the turn a lot of the time, but maybe he was looking to check raise. And, you know, it makes sense, right? I definitely think the opponent should 3-bet or fold his hand pre-flop. Calling from the small blind with King 10 is usually not a great play because it makes King High bad pair from out of position, which is not really where you want to be. So you're usually better off just turning this hand into a bluff. If he 3-bet, I probably would have called. He'd bet the flop, I probably would call. He'd bet the turn, I would have folded. So that clearly would have worked out better for our opponent if they just played it in the somewhat standard way. But they didn't, and because they messed up, we ended up winning the pot. It's always nice when they mess up. So that's going to be it for today. Hope you enjoyed this hand for Poker News. If you did, let me know on Twitter @JonathanLittle. And if you want more poker content from me, check out jonathanlittlepoker.com/YouTube. Or you can just search Jonathan Little on YouTube. Go there, subscribe. I post lots of new content every week, and it's there for you. So check it out. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I'll talk to you next week.